David Nguyen had always been proud of his roots. Born and raised in California to Vietnamese immigrant parents, he had worked his way up from a small-town lawyer to becoming the recently elected mayor of Redwood Hills, a quiet suburban town just outside of San Francisco. It wasn't a major city, but it was home. And more importantly, it was where his mother, Linda Nguyen, had lived for over 40 years in the same modest but well-kept house his late father had left behind. Linda's home was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary filled with memories. Every corner, every creaking floorboard told a story. The marks on the kitchen wall where she had measured David's height as a child, the worn-out armchair in the living room where his father used to sit, and the small backyard garden where Linda spent hours tending to her beloved roses. But lately, her peace had been disturbed by the Homeowners Association, HOA, an organization notorious for its rigid policies and aggressive tactics. The HOA, led by a man named Richard Carter, had been pressuring Linda to sell her house for months. The reason? They wanted to demolish it to expand a parking lot for a new luxury apartment complex being built nearby. Linda had refused every offer, standing firm against their demands. She had called David about it before, frustrated but confident. "They can't force me out, right?" she had asked him on the phone one evening. "Not legally," David had reassured her. "They can try to pressure you, but they have no legal grounds to evict you. If they give you any trouble, let me know, and I'll handle it." But even as he said it, something about the HOA's persistence unsettled him. He had heard rumors about Carter's underhanded tactics, bullying homeowners, fabricating violations, and using loopholes to seize properties under the guise of community improvement. Still, David never imagined they would go this far. David was in a meeting at City Hall when his phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket. Ignoring the calls at first, he finally checked his messages during a break. What he saw made his stomach drop. "David, something terrible happened. Your mom's house. It's gone. HOA bulldozed it this morning. She's outside crying. You need to come home. Now." A cold chill ran down his spine. He didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed his coat and bolted out the door. The drive home felt like an eternity. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced with questions. How could this happen? Hadn't he told her they couldn't force her out? When he finally arrived at the familiar street, his heart stopped. Where his mother's house had once stood, there was now nothing but rubble. Piles of bricks, shattered wood, and debris were scattered across the lot. The small rose garden was trampled beyond recognition. A few men in construction vests stood nearby, laughing and chatting as if they hadn't just destroyed a woman's home. And then he saw her. Linda Nguyen, a frail 75-year-old woman, was sitting on the curb, clutching a small box of belongings, the only things she had managed to save. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face as she rocked back and forth, whispering something in Vietnamese under her breath. David rushed to her side, kneeling down. Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" She looked up at him with hollow eyes that had seen war, refugee camps, and the struggle of rebuilding a life in America, but had never looked this broken. "They took it," she whispered. "They took everything." His blood boiled. "Who did this? Who let them do this?" he demanded, turning toward the construction workers. One of the men, a stocky guy with a clipboard, barely glanced up. "HOA orders, buddy. We're just following instructions." David clenched his fists. He was the mayor of this damn town, and no one had informed him that a house, his mother's house, was scheduled for demolition. He turned to a neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had been watching from her porch, shaking her head in disbelief. "They came early this morning," she explained. "No warning, no notice. Just a crew with bulldozers and some official-looking papers. Your mom tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen. They dragged her outside and knocked everything down." David's jaw tightened. "And Richard Carter? Was he here?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, smug as ever. "He said it was for the good of the community. Then he just left. That was it." David saw red. David helped his mother into his car and drove her to his house. She barely spoke the entire ride, staring blankly out the window. She was homeless now, a woman who had worked her entire life, who had built a home with her own hands, only to have it taken from her in a single morning. He knew one thing for sure. Richard Carter had no idea who he had just messed with. David pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "I need everything you can find on the HOA's legal actions today. I want the demolition orders, the permits, everything. If they forged a single document, I want them buried under lawsuits by tomorrow." Then he made another call. "Get me a meeting with the city attorney. Now." As he hung up, his mother finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but the pain in it was louder than any scream. "They took your father's house, David. They took our home." David reached over and held her trembling hands. "I know, Mom, but I swear to you, I'm going to make them pay." What HOA didn't know was that they hadn't just destroyed a house. They had started a war. And David Nguyen, the mayor of Redwood Hills, was about to make them regret it. David Nguyen sat in his home office, staring at the chaos of paperwork spread across his desk. Legal documents, city ordinances, HOA bylaws. Anything he could find related to the demolition of his mother's house. He had barely slept since the incident, his mind consumed with one thought. How the hell did they get away with this? His mother, Linda, was resting in the guest room down the hall. But resting was a generous term. She had hardly spoken since the demolition. The woman who had once radiated warmth and resilience now looked like a shell of herself. David exhaled sharply and picked up his phone. His assistant, Rebecca Turner, answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I do," she replied, "and it's bad." Rebecca wasted no time. "I checked all the records," she began. The HOA filed an emergency demolition order, claiming the house was structurally unsound and posed a safety risk to the community. It was approved by the county inspector's office 2 weeks ago. David frowned. "That's impossible. The house was perfectly fine." "Exactly, and it gets worse. The inspector who signed off on the report, he doesn't exist." David sat up straight. "What do you mean?" "The signature belongs to a fake official. There's no record of a county inspector named Daniel Rhodes, and his listed credentials are bogus. Someone in the HOA forged the documents to push the demolition through." David's jaw clenched. They hadn't just broken the rules, they had committed fraud. Who authorized the demolition itself? Richard Carter, of course. The next morning, David stormed into the HOA's local office. The receptionist barely had time to look up before he slammed a stack of documents onto the counter. "I want to see Richard. Now," the receptionist stammered. He's in a meeting right now." "Not anymore." David pushed past her and marched into Richard Carter's office. The man was sitting behind his massive oak desk, sipping coffee like he hadn't just destroyed a woman's life. Richard barely looked surprised to see him. "Ah, Mayor Nguyen. What a pleasure. What can I do for you?" David didn't sit. He didn't even blink. "You can start by explaining why the hell my mother's house was bulldozed with a forged demolition order." Richard leaned back, completely unfazed. "Now, let's not get dramatic. The property was condemned. We followed all necessary procedures." David threw the fraudulent documents onto his desk. "This inspector doesn't exist, Carter. This entire process was illegal." Richard smiled, and it made David want to punch him. "That's an awfully bold accusation, Mayor. I hope you have proof." David leaned in. "Oh, I will. And when I do, you're going to regret ever pulling this stunt." Richard took another sip of coffee. "David, let's be reasonable. This was for the betterment of the community. That lot will provide much-needed parking for the new luxury apartments. Your mother's house? It was old. Frankly, it was an eyesore." David saw red. "You destroyed a widow's home for a parking lot?" Richard shrugged. "A parking lot that will increase property values, create revenue, and improve the neighborhood. You're a politician, you should understand how these things work." David's hands clenched into fists. "You have no idea who you just messed with." For the first time, Richard's smug expression faltered. "Are you threatening me, Mayor?" David smiled coldly. "No, Richard. I don't make threats. I make sure people like you get exactly what they deserve." And with that, he turned and walked out. By the time David got back to City Hall, Rebecca was waiting for him. "We have a case," she said. "Forgery, fraud, illegal seizure of property. I spoke with the city attorney, and we can take this to court." "Good. File the lawsuit immediately, and get in touch with the media. I want everyone to know what HOA did to my mother." Rebecca grinned. "Already ahead of you. Reporters are eating this up." Within hours, the story was everywhere. Local HOA demolishes widow's home. Mayor fights back. Illegal land grab? Fraudulent demolition order under investigation. Mayor Nguyen takes on corrupt HOA justice for his mother. The public outcry was swift and brutal. People were furious. HOA members started resigning to avoid the fallout. Even longtime residents who had previously feared speaking out were now demanding justice. And Richard Carter? For the first time, he was panicking. A week later, David got a call from Rebecca. "You won't believe this. Someone from inside the HOA just flipped." "Who?" "A board member, Michael Reynolds. He's willing to testify that Carter personally ordered the demolition and knew the documents were fake." David smiled. This was the break they needed. Within 24 hours, Carter was served with multiple lawsuits: fraud, destruction of property, abuse of power. And, just as David had hoped, the county launched an official investigation into the HOA's practices. Then came the final blow. City Council, under David's leadership, passed an emergency moratorium on all HOA-enforced demolitions until further review. Any property seized illegally would be returned or financially compensated. For Carter, it was checkmate. That night, David sat with his mother on the back porch of his house. She was still quiet, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, a small spark of hope. "I don't want revenge, David," she said softly. "This isn't revenge, Mom. It's justice." She sighed. "I just want to go home." David looked at her, then out into the dark night. "I promise you, Mom, I'm going to build it back, and no one will ever take it from you again." Linda squeezed his hand. "I know you will." As David sat there, he knew the fight wasn't over. But Richard Carter had made one fatal mistake. He thought he could steal a widow's home and get away with it. What he didn't realize was, she was the mother of a mayor, and her son was coming for everything he had. The days following the lawsuit were a whirlwind of legal action, media scrutiny, and desperate attempts by Richard Carter to salvage what little power he had left. But David Nguyen had no intention of stopping until Carter and his corrupt HOA were completely dismantled. The battle wasn't just personal anymore. It had become a movement. David sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. His assistant, Rebecca Turner, walked in with a grim but determined expression. "We got the official county report back," she said, handing him the papers. The demolition was not only illegal, but it also violated multiple zoning laws and historic preservation codes. Your mother's house was legally protected as a heritage property due to its age and cultural significance. David felt his rage reignite. So Carter not only forged documents, he also destroyed a legally protected home? Rebecca nodded. And that's not all. Michael Reynolds gave us more dirt. Turns out Carter's been skimming money from HOA funds for years. Fake maintenance fees, inflated contractor costs. The whole thing is a giant fraud scheme. David smirked. "Let me guess. He's been using HOA money to line his own pockets?" "Bingo. We have financial statements showing massive discrepancies. If we push this, he won't just lose his position. He'll face criminal charges." David leaned back, cracking his knuckles. "Good. Then let's bury him." The next morning, David held a press conference outside City Hall. Reporters swarmed the scene as cameras flashed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the destruction of my mother's home was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of fraud and abuse by a corrupt HOA led by Richard Carter." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Our investigation has uncovered forged documents, financial embezzlement, and illegal land seizures. This is not just about one house. This is about an entire community being exploited for personal gain. A reporter raised her hand. Mayor Nguyen, are you saying Richard Carter committed a crime? David didn't hesitate. I'm saying he committed multiple felonies, and he's about to pay for every single one of them. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Within an hour, news stations were broadcasting the story nationwide. Social media exploded, with thousands calling for Carter's immediate resignation and arrest. Under pressure, the HOA board met in an emergency session. By the end of the day, Richard Carter was removed as HOA president. But David wasn't done. That evening, as Carter was packing up his office, 2 police officers walked in. "Richard Carter?" one of them asked. Carter sneered. "What now?" The officer held up an arrest warrant. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and destruction of protected property. Put your hands behind your back." Carter's face drained of color. "You can't be serious. This is ridiculous," he sputtered. The officer didn't care. He cuffed Carter and led him out of the office as reporters filmed every humiliating second. The mighty HOA president had fallen, and David Nguyen had made sure the world watched. With Carter gone, the HOA was in shambles. Board members scrambled to distance themselves, but David wasn't letting them off the hook. Through legal action, he forced the HOA to white heavy checkmark return all fraudulently taken money to homeowners. White heavy checkmark pay triple the value of his mother's house as restitution. White heavy checkmark terminate all illegal property seizures they had conducted over the years. Most of the remaining board members resigned in disgrace. The HOA's reputation was destroyed, and Redwood Hills residents celebrated their downfall. But for David, the real victory was yet to come. 1 month later, David stood in front of a brand new house, a perfect replica of the home his mother had lost. He had used every cent of the settlement money to rebuild it, brick by brick, restoring it to the way it had always been. As he helped his mother to the front porch, tears welled in her eyes. "It looks just like before," she whispered. David smiled. "It's better, because this time, no one can ever take it away from you again." Linda turned to her son, placing a hand on his cheek. "Your father would be so proud of you, David." For the first time since the demolition, she truly smiled. David took a deep breath, looking at the house, then at the community that had rallied behind them. The battle was over. Justice had been served. And Richard Carter? He sat in a jail cell, facing years behind bars, his empire reduced to nothing. The HOA thought they could steal a home, but they had picked the wrong family to mess with. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Dozens of residents from Redwood Hills had packed the gallery, eager to witness the final verdict in one of the biggest scandals in their community's history. At the defendant's table, Richard Carter sat, his once smug expression replaced with a hollow, defeated stare. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, a stark contrast to the power-hungry HOA president he had once been. David Nguyen sat in the front row, his mother, Linda, beside him. He could feel the tension in the air, but he remained calm. He already knew how this was going to end. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the courtroom before speaking. After reviewing the overwhelming evidence of fraudulent activity, financial embezzlement, and the illegal destruction of private property, this court finds the defendant, Richard Carter, guilty on all charges. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Carter gritted his teeth, his fists clenched at his sides. Furthermore, the judge continued, "The Homeowners Association of Redwood Hills is hereby ordered to pay 3 times the value of the demolished property as restitution to Linda Nguyen." David smiled. "Justice." The judge turned his gaze toward Carter. As for Mr. Carter, given the severity of his actions, his abuse of power, his history of fraudulent activity, and the impact of his crimes on this community, I am sentencing him to 8 years in state prison. The room erupted. Some residents cheered, while others sighed in relief. Linda reached for David's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's over," she whispered. David nodded. "No, Mom. It's just the beginning." With Carter behind bars, the entire HOA system came under scrutiny. Investigators discovered that Richard had engaged in similar fraudulent demolitions over the years, targeting elderly homeowners or those who couldn't fight back. As more victims came forward, the scandal expanded beyond Redwood Hills, reaching state-level investigations. Public outrage forced new legislation, tightening the regulations around HOA powers. Under David's leadership, the city council passed laws limiting HOA control over private property, ensuring this could never happen again. For the first time in decades, residents felt safe in their own homes. David wasted no time using the compensation money. 1 month after the verdict, construction crews broke ground on a brand new home, an exact replica of the house that had been destroyed. But it wasn't just about bricks and wood. David hired local artists and builders to make it a symbol of justice and resilience. The new home was a beacon of hope, a reminder to the community that no one, not even a corrupt HOA, could take away what was rightfully theirs. The day it was completed, Linda stood on the porch, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered. David, standing beside her, nodded. "And this time it's protected. No one can take it away again." Linda smiled, warmth returning to her face. "Thank you, David, for everything." "You don't have to thank me, Mom. You deserve this." Just as David thought the nightmare was over, Rebecca stormed into his office one morning, her face pale. "David, you need to see this." She threw a thick manila folder onto his desk. David opened it and scanned the contents: court documents, old HOA records, and a list of properties seized by Carter over the past decade. His heart stopped. This is a pattern," he muttered. Rebecca nodded. "It is. Carter didn't just do this to your mother. He did it to at least 20 other families. Elderly homeowners, single parents, people he thought couldn't fight back." David exhaled sharply. How did no one catch this before? Because no one had the power to fight him until now. David clenched his jaw. Well, that's about to change. With new evidence in hand, David worked with state prosecutors to reopen old cases. Families who had lost everything were finally getting justice. Some were able to reclaim lost properties, while others received massive settlements from the now-defunct HOA. And Richard Carter? His sentence was extended as more charges piled up. His entire empire crumbled, and by the time he realized it, he had nothing left. Months later, as David prepared for another re-election campaign, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. His mother was safe in her rebuilt home. The HOA was dismantled, and Redwood Hills was no longer a place of fear, but of empowerment. But more than that, David had emerged stronger than ever. He wasn't just a politician anymore. He was a symbol of justice, and he wasn't done yet. As he stood in front of a cheering crowd at his latest campaign event, he looked out at the people who had supported him. "This fight wasn't just for my mother," he said into the microphone. "It was for all of you, and I promise you, no corrupt HOA, no greedy bureaucrat, no one will ever take advantage of you again. Because as long as I'm here, we fight back." The crowd roared. David smiled. Justice had been served, and this was only the beginning.